Okay, welcome back in our discussion on tree reconstruction algorithms. So continuing our discussion today, we will look at another class of methods which is known as character based tree reconstruction algorithms. So just a recap from the last two lectures, we have introduced what phylogenetic trees are, why they are important in life sciences, and we have looked at one class of method so far which is known as distance based algorithms, right. So in the distance based algorithms, remember that we were given a pairwise distance matrix between all species, and using those distances we were looking for the tree that fits the data. So here we were given an n cross n distance matrix and we were looking for a tree that fits the given distance data. So we looked at various properties like how to solve this problem and when is this problem feasible to solve exactly and so on. Now when we were discussing distance based methods, I also mentioned that how are these distances obtained between different species, and one common way of estimating pairwise distances between species is to look at the alignment matrix. So if we take DNA sequences or protein sequences and we do a multiple sequence alignment of those sequences, through those alignments we can infer the distance between those species. So for example, two species that have a low eddy distance between their sequences will have a low distance in the corresponding matrix. So using these alignments we were estimating the evolutionary divergence between each pair of species, and this distance matrix was given as input to the distance based tree reconstruction algorithms. However, observe that when we are obtaining these distances from these alignments, we are also losing information because there is no way in which we can reconstruct back the full alignments from just the distance matrix. So the distance is just calculating the aggregate summary of how the sequences were diverging from end to end. So some information is lost when we are capturing the alignment information with distances. Now driven by this limitation, the motivation for character based methods is that maybe we can directly use the characters observed in the alignments and hope for a better or more accurate reconstruction that is more consistent with the biology, right. So that way we can pass more information to the algorithm. So this lecture will focus on the character based tree reconstruction methods, and within that we will look at one class of methods that is based on maximizing the parsimony. I will share more details about this, but for now I hope the motivation for looking for the character based method is clear. That is, we want to use directly the character information that we have rather than the distances between them. Now in the character based tree reconstruction methods, the input will be a n cross m matrix where n is the number of species and m is the number of characters or features. Each character will have a finite number of discrete states. So for example, we were looking at this example. So each of these, so this is a DNA character in which means that each character can have 4 states A, C, G or T, and in this case you have 5, 10, 15, 19. So you have 19 characters in total. So in this, if this was the input, then you would have 4 species and 19 characters. So this would be a 4 cross 19 matrix that would be given as input to the algorithm. So as I said, each character will have finite number of states. Now some examples of characters are, you can use DNA sequence in which you will have each character will have 4 states that are 4 different nucleotides. You can use protein sequence, in which case each state will have 20 different states. So, each character will have 20 different states corresponding to each amino acid. Also, character can be morphological features as well. For example, you can have number of legs as a character, in which case the states can be 0 to 4 for example. You can have shape of beak as a character as well, in which case the state can be either cone shaped, hook shaped or spear shaped, right, as shown on the top example. So, you can have different type of characters, and in most common scenario you would either use DNA or protein sequences in usual scenarios. So, this is the input that we will be working with. Now, with this input, what optimization criteria should we set to build a tree? That is, we know these characters or features for all the species. What should be our objective function that we can set to build the tree? And once we have set up the optimization criteria, we would also seek for an efficient algorithm that solves for that optimization problem. So, let us look at one possible optimization criteria, which is based on a parsimony approach. Let me show you what parsimony approach is based on this toy example. So, let us say in my toy example I have 4 species that is I have 4 leaves in the tree, and suppose for each leaf I am given 2 characters. One character corresponds to the mouth and the other character corresponds to the shape of eyebrow. So, in the case of mouth, the states are either smile or sad, and in case of eyebrows, the states are normal or pointed. So, this is the hypothetical example that I am using here. So, you have 4, let us say 4 species that have these morphological features. So, you have mouth and eyebrows, and they are observed in 2 different states. Now, for these 4 species, what kind of tree should we aim for? Well, one tree could be shown here. So, we can have a tree like this, where you can draw a tree like this for the 4 species that were given to us. So, these are the 4 species that were given to us, and we can maybe reconstruct the tree in the following way. Another way to reconstruct the tree is with a different labeling. So, maybe I can assume different state for my ancestral species, and in that case I would end up with a different tree. So, how do I decide which tree is better? Well, in the parsimony criteria, what we look for is a tree which minimizes the total number of character state changes across the tree. So, for example, if you are using DNA sequences, then we would want a tree which has minimum mutations involved. That is, you are looking for the simplest possible explanation for the given observed data. So, how can we achieve or how can we reconstruct the tree which involves fewest character changes? So, observe that in the left hand side example, you have one state change here, that is, you have a sad mouth here and you have a happy mouth here. So, you have a one character change on this edge. Similarly, here you do not have any character change. So, there is 0 change. On this edge again you have a shape change in the eyebrow. So, we have a one character change. Similarly, here you have one change and here you have 0 changes on these edges. So, overall this tree, when you are building this tree, you are observing 3 character state changes across the edges of this tree. However, on the right hand side we see, if you again repeat the analysis, you would find that over this tree we need only 2 character state changes to explain the observed species. So, because this tree is requiring fewer character state changes, under the parsimony criteria we would say that the right tree is better, because it is requiring only 2 character state changes. So, this follows the philosophy of Occam's razors, which is, that is, the finding the simplest explanation of the given data. So, the parsimony criteria is to minimize the total number of character state changes in the tree, and therefore, we will look for a tree that involves minimum number of character state changes. So, under the parsimony score, the right tree is better. So, now we can put together our optimization problems. The first one is called a small parsimony problem, in which we are already given a tree shape, that is, we are given the tree T and each leaf is labeled by the m character string. So, these are the present day species for which we have observed data, and the output that we seek is the labeling of internal nodes, that is, what are the characters corresponding to the ancestral species. So, here we are already given the tree topology. So, we know how the tree structure looks like. All we are looking for is the labels of the internal vertices. So, we have to figure out what should be the characters on these internal nodes that would allow us to complete this tree reconstruction. So, this is the small parsimony problem. Another problem is the weighted small parsimony, that is a weighted version of the problem, in which case now we will now assume that the character state changes have different scores. So, for example, previously we were assuming that all character state changes contribute a parsimony score of 1, but that may not be practical, because maybe not all state changes are equally likely. For example, in case of DNA sequence, changes from A to C, C to G, G to T, they are not all equally likely. So, therefore, in that case we can have a pairwise matrix, pairwise scoring matrix, in which we can indicate the score of each character state change. So, for example, A to A would cost 0. So, all the diagonal elements will be 0, because there is no change here, but everywhere else A to C, for example, could be 9, A to G change, that score could be 4, and so on. Now, with these weights we can again ask for a tree that minimizes the weighted parsimony score. So, that is, we have to fill the internal vertices, that is, we have to find the labels of these internal vertices such that we minimize this weighted parsimony score, where the weighted parsimony score is calculated by looking at all the edges of the tree and counting the character state changes, where each character state change, let us say from on edge from V to W, suppose there is a change of C to G, then we will count it as 4. So, we have to minimize all these character state changes, where the contribution of each character state change is given by this matrix. So, this is the weighted version of this problem. Now, finally, the third optimization problem is the large parsimony problem, in which case again we are given the n cross m matrix. However, this time we are not given the tree topology. It is up to us now to find a tree topology which has exactly n leaves that are labeled by the n rows of the matrix, and we have to also give the labeling of the internal vertices such that the parsimony score is minimized over all possible trees and over all possible labeling of the internal vertices. Now, as you can immediately see, this is much harder to solve because now we are minimizing over all possible tree shapes and we are minimizing over all possible labeling of internal vertices. So, in the small parsimony problem, we were already given the tree, we were only looking for labeling of the internal vertices. In large parsimony problem, we are not given the tree, we have to look for the tree topology as well as the possible labeling of all the internal vertices. So, this is a much harder problem. Now, let us start thinking of algorithms for how to solve these problems, and I want to start by looking at the weighted small parsimony problem because the algorithm for solving this is most intuitive. So, let me remind you that again you are given as input tree T, a binary tree in which each leaf is labeled by a m character string. So, these are the observed features. So, in this example m is equal to 3 here. So, here the example, because you have 3 characters for each leaf. The question is, how do we label the internal vertices so that the parsimony score is minimized? How would you solve this problem? Well, okay. So, first observation which may be useful in finding the algorithm is observe that this problem can be solved independently for each character. That is, we do not have to look for all m characters simultaneously, we can look them one by one. This is because the contribution of each character to the total parsimony score is independent of each other. For example, if we go back to the same example, toy example below that was shown earlier, observe that the contribution of eyebrows is independent of the contribution of mouth to the total parsimony score. So, we can independently minimize this as well as we can independently minimize the parsimony score corresponding to mouth character. So, these both can be independently minimized. So, what that means is that we have to solve the problem for only one character. If we can solve the problem for one character, we can repeat it, we can repeat the algorithm multiple times for each character. So, that simplifies our problem. That is, now we can assume that we are given a tree that is labeled by a single character on each leaf and we are given a scoring matrix k cross k. So, now the problem is simplified because we have only single character on each leaf node and all we have to find is what state should be assigned to these internal vertices so that the parsimony score is minimized. So, again, so we have still not solved the problem, we have just managed to simplify the problem for now. To solve the problem, we have to look for another observation here. Observe that we can break the given problem into easier sub problems. How? Well, there is a substructure. Let STV denote the minimum parsimony score of the subtree rooted at V. So, if there is a node V, consider the subtree rooted at V. It is the minimum parsimony score of this tree under the assumption that we assign state T to this vertex V. So, if we assign this state T here, then STV denotes the minimum parsimony score that is achieved by this subtree rooted at V. So, that is the notation that we want to give. Let us also define delta ij as the score of changing from state I to j. So, this is directly available from the scoring matrix. So, this is the ijth element in the scoring matrix. Now, observe if suppose internal vertex V has children u and w as shown on the top. So, if vertex V has two children u and w, then observe that we can recursively solve for STV. That is, we can define STV in terms of the optimal answer of their children. So, STV can be defined as minimum over all states possible at children u plus the corresponding state change score plus considering all possible states at child w and the corresponding character change score. So, in other words, we are saying that we will consider all possible states here. So, while let us say to calculate S V at state t, we are saying that we will enumerate over all possible states at u and we will enumerate over all possible states at V. So, I can say S I u where I belongs to 1 to k. So, I will enumerate over all these values. I will check which of them gives me the minimum value at STV, because there is a substructure here, right. I can look at the overall parsimony score at V in terms of the parsimony scores of subtree rooted at U plus subtree rooted at W. And because of this recursive structure, we can solve this problem efficiently. So, here is another visualization, that is when we are computing at S, let us say A V, that is we want to look for the minimum parsimony score possible for subtree rooted at V, assuming we assign A state to this vertex. This can be calculated as, we can consider all possible states at U, right. So, that would be minimum over S A U plus delta A A, because we have a, if we assign A to U, then we have to consider state change from A to A, which is 0. Similarly, we have to consider the possibility of C state at U, then there would be a change of C to A. So, let me rewrite this. So, again we can consider state G here, delta G to A, and the last possibility is T at U plus delta T A, and similarly the contribution from right hand side. So, that would be again minimum over again all possible S A W plus delta A A, S A C W delta C A, and so on. So, basically we are enumerating over all states at child vertices U and W, and through that we can calculate the corresponding optimal score at vertex V as well. So, we can fill that was, so we would put the value here, and similarly we can repeat this process for C, G as well as T. So, at each vertex we are considering all possible states, and then we are asking for the minimum parsimony score assuming that state for that vertex. So, this algorithm was given by Sankoff in 1975, and because of this recursion, now we can execute this recursion and run the dynamic programming algorithm. So, first apply the recursion to the leaf nodes, that would be initialization. So, at the leaf node basically the score would be 0 if your state is equal to the. So, here for example initialization would correspond that if your leaf node is already given to be A, then you would assign a score of 0 at A and infinity otherwise, because these are not allowed, right. So, the initialization step is simple. So, at each leaf node, because the data is already observed, for the observed state you would give a score of 0, otherwise for unobserved states you would give a score of infinity, because those are not allowed. Now, we will compute the recursion in the bottom up order in the tree, that is going from leaves all the way up to the root. So, we will compute the recursion in the bottom up order and we will go all the way up to the root, and finally the minimum parsimony score will be given by the smallest score at the root node, that is over all possible states what is the minimum score achieved at the root. Once we know the optimal parsimony score, we will then identify the labels at the internal nodes using backtracking. Let me show you a complete working example as well. So, that is the initialization step that I am showing you here. At the leaf nodes, initialization is trivial, that is based on the observed states. You can directly initialize the scores as shown here. Now, we will move our way from bottom to up. So, we will compute at the internal nodes now, and we will finalize the values corresponding to these. So, that is if this node is V, then I compute SAV, STV and so on, and that I can do based on the recursion, because I already have the values at the children. I can apply the recursion and solve these values at the internal nodes. So, now if you apply the recursion, for example for at A, what would be the value at A? So, that would be from left hand side you can only consider state A, because everything has an infinity. So, for state A it will be A to A, so that would be 0, because A to A state change, there is no change, plus on the right hand side you will have to change the state from C to A, right. So, these are not allowed because of infinity. So, you would pick C and you would make a state change from C to A. So, this now from here scoring matrix you can look at that C to A change is 9. So, therefore, you would do 0 plus 9 and this would become 9. Similarly, you can apply the recursion to all other values and you will end up with filling this table for all states at the internal nodes. We can go one further up and then we can compute these values at root, and we will compute these values and find out the entire table. Now, once we have computed the entire table, we can immediately see that the optimal parsimony score possible is when we assign state T to the root node. So, therefore, I can assign state T to the root node, which corresponds to the parsimony score 9, which is the least possible. And then I can backtrack. Basically, I can ask what value should I pick from A, these and these, that allows me to choose 9, that allows me to achieve a score of 9. So, that can be done by easy backtracking, that is if you pick 7 and 2, that is T and T here, then that root node would correspond to 9. So, you can work your way backwards and keep assigning the final states to the internal nodes as well. So, that you would work in a top down manner now. So, I hope this dynamic programming approach is clear. If you look at the time complexity, observe that we compute order nk scores during the algorithm, because for each vertex we are computing k different scores, where k is the number of different states. So, in this example k was 4, because at each node we are filling a table of size 4. So therefore, we are filling total order nk scores in the entire dynamic programming, and computing each score takes order k time, because we are iterating over all possible values in the recursion. So remember that in the recursion we are computing over all possible states at the children. So filling each value takes order k time, because we have to consider all possible states. So now, because filling each value takes order k time and you have order nk values to compute, the total time needed to solve the problem per character is order nk square. And remember that we were working on a simplified problem, that is, we were looking at one character one at a time. So we have to run this algorithm m times if we are given m character string on each leaf node. Therefore, the total time becomes m n k square. So this was a classic Sankoff algorithm that can be applied for weighted small parsimony problem. So we have now understood how, if we are given a tree and if we are given the characters at the leaf nodes, then we know how to solve the labels of internal nodes such that we minimize the parsimony score. And so therefore we are able to reconstruct the full tree using Sankoff's algorithm in order m n k square time. Okay, so now moving ahead, so this problem is solved. Now let us look at maybe the easier problem, which was the unweighted case. So what if we have to solve this problem where we are not given a scoring matrix, that is, each character state change contributes to a score of 1. So in some sense this is an easier problem than the weighted case, because now the weights of all character state changes are equal. So equivalently we can say that this is the, you can assume this as a scoring matrix where all the character states are contributing a score of 1 to the parsimony score. So if you have a change of A to C or A to G or A to T, any change will contribute a score of 1 to the parsimony score. Now how do we solve this problem? Well, one obvious solution is that we can apply the Sankoff's algorithm again, right, because if it works for weighted scenario, it will also work for unweighted scenario as well, because all we have to do is assume that delta ij is equal to 1 if I not equal to j, and we can repeat the same algorithm. But it turns out that the unweighted case can be solved using a faster algorithm. How? Let us see. So this algorithm is from Fitch and it works as following. Let capital SV be the set of possible states at a vertex V. For each leaf we will say SV will be predefined. So SV will only consist of a single state that is already given to that leaf node, because the states of the leaf nodes are already fixed. So SV will only consist of a single state for all the leaf nodes. Now as we look at the internal node now, suppose the internal node V has children U and W. Then SV can be computed using the following recursion. If SU and SW overlap, that is, they have a common element, then we will say that SV is equal to SU intersection SW. However, if the intersection is empty, then we will simply say that SV equals to union of both sets. Now it is not entirely clear why are we doing this, but that will be clear in a few slides now. But that is the simple algorithm, that how Fitch algorithm work. Let me show a quick illustration. So at the leaf nodes, as I said, the set will be determined based on the given label of the leaf node. So, here the set is G, here it is G, here the set is C, and here the set is A. Now, as we work our way up, on this node observe that the intersection is empty, that is, so there is no overlap between these two sets. So, therefore, we would union the two sets and compute the capital S set as union, which is A comma C. In this case, both the sets overlap, and in which means that we will take an intersection, and the intersection of G with G is simply G. So, here we took union and here we took intersection. What about the root node? Well, observe that again there is no overlap between these two sets. So, therefore, that again we will, following this recursion, we will do the union and compute the union, that is A comma C comma G. So, this illustration is basically is to convey how we are computing these sets from in the bottom up manner. But from these sets, how do we decide the final optimal state of each internal node? So, how are these sets helping us to solve this problem? The procedure is as following. So, then in this algorithm, what we will do is we will consider the vertices in top down order now. We will assign any state to the root node R from its set SR. So, we will consider SR and we will pick any state from SR and assign it to the root. For internal node V, we will check if the already assigned state of its parent is in SV. If yes, we will choose the same state. If not, we will pick any arbitrary state from SV and assign it to node V. Let me illustrate through the example. So, we will pick any random state from ACG and assign it to the root node. So, let us say we pick A in this case. Now, at this node, based on the algorithm that we just discussed, I will check whether any state from this set has been assigned to the parent node already or not. So, it looks like yes, A has already been assigned to the root node. So, I will pick A here. At this set, there is no match with the root node, and I will pick arbitrary state from this set, which is G, because there is only one element in this set. So, this way I would assign the final states to the internal nodes as well. Now, this algorithm is not as intuitive as the Sankoff's algorithm, because Sankoff's algorithm was very intuitive, that is, we were considering all possibilities at the children and then we were solving our way up. But here the algorithm is not as intuitive. Well, here is how one can prove the correctness. At first glance, both algorithms, that is the Fitch's algorithm and Sankoff's algorithm, appear to be very different. That is, Sankoff's algorithm was following a proper dynamic programming recursion which was very intuitive, whereas the way we are computing sets using union and intersection is not intuitive here in Fitch algorithm. But if you take a closer look, you will find that both algorithms are almost identical. In Sankoff's algorithm, we say that the state T is optimal for vertex V if it yields the smallest score among all possible values. In Fitch's algorithm, we are only keeping track of the optimal states, that is what forms the set capital SV. Observe that if you consider V as a parent node and U and V W are the children, if SU and SW overlap, it should be easy to see why SV should be intersection of both sets, because if you apply Sankoff's recurrence, you will immediately get that SV should be intersection of these two sets, because remember that we are working on an unweighted case, and if you apply Sankoff's recurrence on these sets, you will understand why this intersection is happening here. Similarly, if SU and SW do not overlap, and again you apply Sankoff's recurrence idea, you will understand why SV equals union of both sets. I will leave this detail to you because it requires a certain amount of case by case analysis, but if you think about it and if you look at the Sankoff's recurrence carefully, you will find that the same recurrence is being applied in Fitch's algorithm as well. The remark number 2 is that Fitch's algorithm is faster than Sankoff's algorithm, because we are only keeping track of optimal states now. So, the runtime complexity analysis works as following, because at each vertex we are only computing set unions and set intersections, which can be done in order k time. Therefore, the total time spent per character is order nk across the entire tree reconstruction algorithm. But again, because we have to run this algorithm m times, because remember that we were running this algorithm one character at a time. So, because we have to run this algorithm m times, the total time will be m times n times k, which makes it faster than the Sankoff's algorithm, because Sankoff algorithm was using m n k square time. So, therefore, we can say that Fitch's algorithm is sort of mimicking Sankoff's algorithm, but it is optimized well for the unweighted case. What about the large parsimony problem? Remember that in the small parsimony problem we were already given a tree, and all we had to do was to look for the labelings of the internal node. Whereas the harder part in large parsimony problem is that we are not given the tree at all. So, we have to figure out the tree ourselves. All we are given is the leaf labels, that is it. So, we have to minimize the parsimony score over all possible trees and over all possible vertex labelings. Now, remember that if we were to think of an exhaustive search over all possible trees, that is not possible, because we have already seen that the number of trees grows very quickly with the number of leaves. In fact, if you consider 53 species, that is 53 leaves, the number of trees exceeds the number of atoms in the universe. So, exhaustive search of all possible trees is not practically possible. And in fact, it turns out that a large parsimony problem has been proven to be NP complete. That is, there is no polynomial time algorithm to solve this problem optimally. Therefore, in practice, different types of heuristics are used to solve this problem. For example, greedy heuristics, branch and bound heuristics, and so on. However, we will not be covering those heuristics in the course syllabus. So, I want to emphasize that the large parsimony problem is much harder to solve, and in practice heuristics are used to solve this problem. So, this completes the module 6 here, that is, we have completed our discussion of tree reconstruction algorithms. We have looked at both distance based methods as well as character based methods, and in both cases we have looked at efficient algorithms on how we can solve the tree reconstruction algorithms efficiently. In general, I want to summarize this module by saying that the phylogenetic tree reconstruction methods are essential in understanding evolutionary relationships. These are used to understand a variety of fundamental biological questions. So, in general, in this field there are large number of mathematical, statistical, algorithmic ideas, and we have only looked at a small subset of these ideas. There are also many research problems. For example, how to accurately compute evolutionary tree of a million species is still an open problem. So, therefore, this is also an active research topic. With that, we will close this lecture. In the next module, we will look at probabilistic and machine learning models for sequences. Thank you.